guys to check it out. That said, getting all the the ugly stuff out of the way, we want to dive in a little bit to some updates on the conflict, and I want to get Danny's thoughts on those. And we're also going to open this up too for questions and comments. So please go ahead and if there's something you want us to talk about, or something you're curious about, something you're not sure is accurate, anything like that, please go ahead and drop it in the comments, and I'm going to do my best to go through it, and we'll address questions here at the end. But initially off the top, Danny, I think the two big developments here have been, one, the sort of new IDF maneuvers that we've seen in the past 48 hours to push on a east-west axis south of Gaza City to sort of cut it off from the rest of Gaza. And it appears that encirclement really is the first strategic objective for the IDF here. I'm curious, and I'm going to go ahead and put the map up here for folks to understand what we're talking about while you're talking, Danny. But I'm curious, again, as somebody that is, a former armor officer that has 4 combat deployments, that knows this region very well, what is your assessment of the way that the IDF is going about this? Do you think that they are going to be successful in kind of trying to cut off North Gaza and Gaza City and focus on that? Or do you feel like, there are maybe some questions about the sort of tactical soundness of some of these maneuvers? Or do you feel like they're going about it in a way that will, lead to a strategic success? And again, we can get into that later too, a separate question on whether or not you really can, eliminate Hamas when we're talking about, an ideology here and not so much a group. But I'm curious for your thoughts on just what we've seen over the last, 48 hours or so from the Israelis on the ground, and your assessments of their maneuver.
Yeah, that there are 2 separate questions here. One is just the military tactics and the plan that's going on, and then the second one is the strategy and the political outcomes that are sought by the use of military power. Those are 2 separate but definitely interrelated things. So let's look at it first of all from the tactical position. I have seen that move to appear to cut off Gaza basically in half from the east to the west, trying to go to the coast. Then there's also 2 other incursions in the northwest, along the coast, also in the northern part. And then there's a built-up area, like a suburb of Gaza in the northeast corner, that is also seen incursions. So there's 3 separate axes of advance that we've seen from the IDF so far. And from the best I can tell so far, they're basically setting the stage for sustained operations that they're going to have to go through to actually attain the military tactical objectives of destroying Hamas. And that is, you're going to have to do the ugly groundwork, the building by building, sometimes floor by floor, house by house, room by room in some cases. Look, there's no easy answer to this. There's no easy path. It's bloody, and it's going to be time consuming, because since they have set the political objective of the destruction of Hamas, that means that they have to go and sweep them out of the entire area. And look, the city was home to 650,000 people, just that one section alone. And it's going to take a long, long time. If you just had to physically go through the buildings, much less have to fight your way through them, you can see that it would take months to do. But since it's going to be hotly contested, I expect this to take quite a bit of time. So what you see with these incursions so far is, with the southern one, it's physically cut off so that Hamas can't get supplies from the south. I think that's one of the biggest purposes of that. They're going to try and cut off the coast as well, so that no supplies can come in nefariously from outside, whether it's Hezbollah or Iran or whoever else. So it can't land on the coast. So they want to basically completely isolate Hamas within the city of Gaza, so that they can't get replenished with anything: ammunition, arms, food, and water. I mean, that's part of this is a siege warfare. But in order to succeed, they're going to have to, once they get the conditions set and they get all their base of operations set, they get the whole thing cut off, then there's no way around going in and starting to methodically move, probably neighborhood by neighborhood. And again, I just can't stress enough that this is going to be a very expensive fight for infantry. and a lot of the technological capacities and advancements that Israel has in armor, with their Merkava tanks, with the Namer infantry fighting vehicles, and a lot of their defensive capacities that they have, certainly with their drones and other things. Those things will be much less useful once they get into the business of clearing buildings. Now, one of the possibilities that they may do, and we've certainly seen some evidence this could be in the path, is that instead of clearing all the buildings, they could start doing what Russia did in the latter stages of the Bakhmut fight, where instead of going in and clearing out each of these houses, that fight took 9 months. But some of the latter part they did was literally to destroy every building, where the tall buildings, wherever there was Ukrainian defenders, because they had been fighting from multiple floors. So they had snipers, firing down on the Russians as they're moving through the streets. They had booby traps set within the building, so it was very expensive for Russia to go in. And one of the latter stages, they just started destroying the building entirely with the Fab 250, 500 bombs is what they're called. It's glide bombs. And one wonders if Israel, with certainly a much stronger capacity bombs, with up to 2,000-pound bombs that we've seen used, is that if they might not follow a similar strategy of, instead of going building by building and clearing them out, if they don't just destroy the building. Of course, now that's going to cause a lot of problems, because then you've got the issue of all that rubble that you're building, because Hamas can fight from the rubble, and it's still required to clear that out. But the bigger issue is then you get into the strategy, and then what is going to happen to all these roughly 1 million Gazans that have fled to the south and got on the backside of that cordon that they put in the south? What are they going to do afterwards? I mean, they're already crammed into the southern half of the Gaza Strip already, and if they have nowhere to go, I mean, you could have a literal humanitarian catastrophe, even long term. And that's assuming that they actually get that. And really, real quick, jump on the strategic part of it that you just mentioned. Can Israel affect, with military means, the political objective of destroying Hamas? And we understand, I think you and I talked maybe on the previous episode here, that Hamas that means a resistance. And so you can't kill resistance. And the conditions under which in the Gaza Strip, especially over this last summer when it got really pointed, and there was lots of Palestinian losses to the IDF within the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and the anger just reached an explosion point, and that's why we had here. Those conditions will now be substantially worsened, even if you accomplish the tactical objective of killing all the Hamas fighters, because the very conditions that gave rise to their violence will now be much worse, because the hatred for Israel will be even higher among all the survivors, because their homes were destroyed, whole families were destroyed, other family members that survived, will be looking for revenge. And I just don't know how they can accomplish that goal of bringing peace to Israel. And that's if I could say anything to the Israeli leadership, I'd say you guys got to change course right now before you even go in to get out the Hamas fighters. Because if you don't, and it's not even just take care of the Palestinian population, though that's just on a moral grounds, that's something that they should be doing, and certainly on legal humanitarian grounds and the laws of land warfare, which you and I have talked about also. But they have to say, how can peace be attained for the Israeli civilian population? Even if you're just thinking selfishly for the Israeli position, they have to create the conditions that permit peaceful coexistence between the Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza. And if they just literally destroy everything, and then they don't do anything to alter the conditions, then the situation will be worse for Israel after having suffered all the casualties that they're going to suffer going through these buildings. And that's one of the things I don't think they're thinking much about. They
I want to jump in there really quick, Danny, on a counterterrorism perspective, right? Because I think the great part of our conversations, especially for listeners, right? You bring the military experience, I bring the intel experience. I really want to underscore some of what you just said. Okay, I was intimately involved in the counter-ISIS fight in Iraq and Syria, and I know a lot of people draw comparisons to Hamas and ISIS and other groups like that, and there are some ways where that's warranted, other ways where it's not. It really depends on what specifically you're talking about. But I think on this issue of post-conflict governance, it's actually a very good comparison to make, right? Because the global coalition to defeat ISIS was able to destroy the physical caliphate, right, as it was called, in Iraq and Syria. But the sources of Salafi extremism that fuel ISIS still exist, right, in pockets all over the Islamic world, right? Even today, so even though ISIS is no longer a major threat, it's never going to be eliminated, quote unquote, right? Like that's like the ideological drivers and the public grievances will continue to be manipulated, right, by somebody, and will continue to attract disaffected Palestinians to radicalism absent any kind of political change. And that's why, for me right now, it's hard to imagine a workable alternative to Hamas under the status quo. And I think something similarly radical is likely to grow from the ruins of Hamas if, again, status quo here, if something in the political, social, other dynamics, right, are not changed. And I think what concerns me is that if you look around what the other options are for Gaza, right, the Palestinian Authority has no credibility in Gaza. They barely have any credibility anywhere else. The Israelis have made multiple statements that they have no desire to, to maintain a long-term, occupation of Gaza, like as a, from a governance perspective. And this is the same thing that we faced following the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And what happened after that? A civil war, the rise of ISIS, and then ultimately the expansion of Iranian influence all across the region. I mean, ironically, right, we try to justify our presence in the Middle East as pushing back on Iran a lot of the time, but all we've done, especially in Iraq, is turn it into a mini Iran. I mean, right, it is a total Shia dominated, the popular mobilization forces, everybody else, they're totally beholden to Iran. So in that way, it kind of backfired on us strategically. So I think it is important to underscore what you're saying, Danny, that the post-conflict governance is so much more important than talking about the as much as we may love to do it, right, the tactical aspects on the battlefield and what we think is going to happen next and where it's going to go.
And let me ask you, actually, I'll just jump in, but while we're still on the tactical part, because there's a separate issue that I think bears examination. Now, you had both Secretary of State Blinken and Defense Austin on the Capitol Hill day before yesterday in a big Senate hearing, trying to make the administration's case that we need 106 billion, 14 of which is for Israel, so that they can continue to fight. And that was what we put on there. And of course, President Biden has been asked by 60 Minutes 2 weeks prior, can we do both? Can we actually maintain our own military capacity, still give a bunch of more stuff to Ukraine, and now add a new thing here to Israel? At the same time, we're also trying to give some new categories of things to Taiwan to make them more defensible. Now, let's look at what that's going to mean in the near term. So Israel is, like I said at the beginning, this is probably going to be multiple months. And if they try the path of let's blow all the buildings up and let's keep having this, extremely high burn rate of their heavy missiles. I mean, I don't know what their capacity was going into this, but I mean, it can't be that big that you can maintain this level of firing for a long time. And then they're going to start burning through all especially their heavy ordnance, and they may start running out. So if they let's say that they get in this like a month and a half, 2 months, and all of a sudden now they don't have enough missiles to literally level every building. So they have to start going in on the ground, and that causes more civilian casualties, but it also causes more Israeli Defense Force casualties. So they could literally start getting ground down and bogged down, much like the battle for Bakhmut did to the two sides that are in there. Now that's bad on its own service, but let me ask you this, especially because now in your area of expertise in the intel part, I think Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah in Lebanon, is apparently supposed to make some big speech tomorrow, and who knows what that's going to be. But my question is going to be, if Israel gets in here and say a month and a half from now gets bogged down, and then Hezbollah attacks, once Israel's capacity is low, their troops have been wounded, and they've suffered a lot of casualties, and their missile barrage has been depleted, that's going to be a bigger strategic vulnerability.
Yeah, look, I'm glad you mentioned that, Danny, because that was kind of a nice segue to the other topic I wanted to get to that I think everybody is rightfully very focused on today, we've seen skirmishes in the Sheba Farms area of the Lebanese border for several weeks now, right? And that's mostly involved indirect fires, rockets, mortars, artillery, things like that. Earlier today, though, we saw a one-way attack drone launch from Hezbollah into Israel. And so the use of drones is a bit of an escalation there as far as the tactics, techniques, and procedures that Hezbollah has been using to this point. So I find that a little concerning. And then I also think you're right. When we talk about, doing good intel analysis and we talk about looking for indicators and warning, something like Nasrallah's speech is going to be very, very interesting tomorrow. So he has not made any kind of major public statement or address for 4 weeks now, since the entire conflict has began. So this is I think a moment that he's choosing to, I would imagine, make a pretty forceful statement about what Hezbollah is going to do next.
Hey,
I
now
think,
correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't I see in the news maybe a week or so ago that he was in, I believe, Qatar and met with some Iranian people as well? Did I hear that right?
yeah, right. He's been around the region. He's been in some press photos. He's done stuff like that, but he hasn't really made a sort of a if you will prime time kind of address basically to Hezbollah, to really the wider Muslim and Arab worlds on what he sort of what he wants to see happen next. There were a couple of statements in previous weeks from him as well, including a handwritten letter to Hezbollah fighters saying that you are all now martyrs on the road to Jerusalem, which certain people have said, even that rhetoric is kind of an escalation because it represents that, right, the way that Nasrallah is looking at this is it is kind of the final battle for Jerusalem and it's starting now. And he hasn't used that kind of language in the past. Again, I think that we have to be, careful with those kind of statements because they're obviously always, intended to appease their own kind of constituencies and to signal to other leaders and things like that. So I'm not, I saw those letters and things like that in the past couple of weeks. I did not put too much importance on them. I think what he says tomorrow will tell us a lot about whether or not Hezbollah wants to get involved. And I think it's a good opportunity to educate the audience a little bit. We talk about this term proxy all the time. And if you've been reading the news or you've been looking at, coverage of the conflict on X or on, social media or other places, you'll see, Iran-backed proxies and Hezbollah as a proxy and this and that, right? I think it's important to explain to people, in military terms and intel terms, what is a proxy, right? So Hezbollah is definitely an Iranian proxy, as are many of the Shia militia groups in Iraq and Syria that have been attacking U.S. troops there. But it's important to note, right, that not all of these groups, of which there are dozens, are directly accountable to Tehran. And so I think a helpful way to think about it is a proxy is an independent organization that maintains a line of communication, a lock as we call it, usually through a shared command and control node, right? So we're talking about C2, to a host organization, right? And that proxy is taskable, meaning that it can accept, and execute specific orders from that host. So Iranian influence, if we're using that very technical definition, Iranian influence over many of these groups doesn't always hit that threshold. So with groups like Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq or with Hezbollah, general in Lebanon, it absolutely does, right? Those groups are trained, funded, equipped, and directed by Iran. There's no question about that.
Okay,
I think,
so let me ask
yeah,
you something, Mike, because this is something I've really been wanting to even ask you, given your knowledge of the area. But I've seen mentioned in a lot of the media, just sort of as an aside, but that the role Qatar plays, because everybody's talking about that Hamas gets all this money, whatever, from Iran, but apparently, at least from what I've understand, is they get more of their percentage wise from Qatar than they do from Iran. And so many of these people have met in Qatar, both with Nasrallah, with Iranian people, and certainly Hezbollah, Hamas leaders as well. Can you tell me a little bit about, what is role is Qatar playing in this? Because we have a base in Qatar as well, and they seem to be playing both sides of this kind of out in the open.
Yeah, that's a good point, Danny. I'm gonna address that in a sec. I'm gonna just kind of tie that bow off so that everybody's clear on the proxy point, right? And Danny raises a good point. All of these groups are there. It's a gradient, right? When we talk about how much Iranian control and influence there is over these groups. For groups like Hezbollah, 100%, you bet. For some of these really tiny Shia militias in Syria, not as much, right? Maybe they're arming them, maybe they're equipping them, but they're not able to task them or direct them to conduct attacks and things like that. So I think that's an important disclaimer. But the issue of Qatar is really important, Danny. And I think one thing that the U.S. needs to be pushing harder on is for Qatar to work to do way more than they're doing to release these hostages, because Hamas leadership is based in Doha. I mean, this is ridiculous. So the U.S. needs to step up its pressure on the Qataris. And I know that we have, Al Udeid Air Base there. We have, they sort of, like you've said, they're playing both sides. They want U.S. protection and influence, and they like having an air base there, right? That they feel like that protects them and provides sort of a security blanket to them in the region. But at the same time, yeah, they've openly sided with Hamas here, and there needs to be more pressure from the State Department, from the Pentagon, on Qatar to say, look, if we have to, we'll pull forces out of Al Udeid Air Base, right? Or if we have to, we're spreading all these Patriot missile batteries around the region to, help protect, the George or the Saudis, whatever. Maybe you're not going to get any of them. Okay, maybe you're not going to get any of them. So I think that there's definitely an opportunity there when we talk about, well, what should the U.S. do and how can the U.S. help, but not, participate in a situation where it's involving itself in a massive war. I think putting more pressure on Qatar is a absolutely an excellent suggestion, and I think it's something that the U.S. has been a little bit afraid to do. Again, because of your point about that, trying to get still get their help in some of these other domains when we talk about counterterrorism or basing or things like that. But it's a good point, Danny, and I think that that's an easy win for the U.S. to say, look, we are the largest foreign direct investor in Qatar. Okay, their economy is massively dependent on U.S. banking, on our financial system, on everything. We could turn all of that stuff off overnight, and we could say
But
it's not
will
coming
we?
back on. Right,
That's
it's
the
not coming
question.
back
Will
on
we?
until you get them out of here. Right.
Because it's funny. I don't know if you saw, but last night, uh, President Biden was at a campaign fundraising event, and he was heckled by somebody in the crowd who said, ceasefire now, and take care of the Palestinian civilians or something like that. And he kind of shot back that, yeah, I'm thinking about doing a pause anyway. And by the way, I'm the one that got Sisi to open that gate, and I'm the one that got Netanyahu to agree to let some of those hostages out. So he's kind of being cocky about what he can do there. But then one has to wonder, is he also going to do anything with Qatar along the lines you just mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, and this is the thing, the U.S. has leverage in the region with all of the funding and all of the aid and all of the military and intel support that it provides to a number of countries in the Arab world. And one thing I think that I've been disappointed in is the U.S. has been very reluctant to flex more of that muscle, right? Right. When we talk about how do we avoid getting the U.S. sucked into a war, but still push for a better outcome here, there's tons of aid that we give to Egypt, that we give to Jordan, that we give to a number of these countries, and we could very easily say, you're gonna open, the Rafah crossing in Egypt, for example, or you're gonna lose out on U.S. aid, right? The calculus for those leaders, as concerned as they are about radicalism among those populations and their own kind of domestic security situations, trust me, those concerns, and as valid as they may be, those concerns disappear overnight if you get a call from the president or the secretary of state that says, yeah, those 10, $14 billion a year that you get, yeah, we might have to rethink that. So there's a lot of soft power. There's a lot of economic hard power that the U.S. can throw around. And I want to quickly turn to some of the comments. I see you guys have been putting some questions in there, and I want to have Danny kind of address them really quick. AO says, if Hezbollah declares war on Israel, do you think the U.S. will escalate operations? Danny, any thoughts on that?
Oh, sorry, had clicked off my mic for a sec. You said Hezbollah, right?
Yeah, the question in the comments was, if Hezbollah declares war on Israel, do you think the U.S. will escalate operations?
Yeah. So there is a lot of talk in the United States about doing exactly that. Lindsey Graham, who loves war more than anybody in America, would love to do that, and he's actually openly called for it. That would be terrible. Absolutely not. We should not do it. You've had actually Israel say, no, we can handle this. We can handle the two-front war. We're good enough to do that. And look, that's the reason why we've been giving them 3.8 billion every year for defense capabilities, so that they can handle their national defense. We don't have an Article 5 type treaty with Israel. It's not our job to do. It's not in our interest to do. Israel can and will take care of its national security, because it will be hard if Hezbollah comes in. But Hezbollah is not like, say, the Turkish army, which has an air force, a navy, a large ground force, and a state behind it to sustain combat operations. They're I won't say a glorified terrorist organization. Well, maybe I will. They're a glorified terrorist organization. They've got 150,000 reported rockets, so they have an arsenal, but they don't have the ability to maintain and sustain combat operations over time, which Israel does. Israel would get even more support from the U.S. if that ever happened, in terms of weapons, ammunition, and intelligence support. But they don't need the personnel. They have them on the ground. They can handle this. And I know there'll be a lot of reflexive calls for it, but look, Israel's done it before. They did it in 1967. They did it in 1973. We didn't come in on their side with military force then. We don't need to do it now.
Yeah, I think that's important, because a lot of people are looking at that tripwire, and it's a good question from the audience, because I think, like, the assumption now is, okay, so if Hezbollah gets involved, that's a two-front war for the Israelis, and that would automatically necessitate the U.S. entering the conflict militarily. And I've gone back and forth on this. I don't think at this point that the U.S. would get as involved as people think they would. I think you may see, U.S. Tomahawk strikes on areas of southern Lebanon. You may see more U.S. air support from those two carrier strike groups in the region to enable Israeli operations. You've already seen that with some of the refueling that's going on, right? The U.S. and the Israeli jets are interoperable, right? Most of them are American made. They can be refueled by American tankers, these kinds of things. That also plays into any kind of long range strike capabilities if the Israelis wanted to attack, IRGC sites or Houthi sites in Yemen that have been launching a lot of these ballistic missiles. So I think, to Danny's point, there are lots of tools actually that the Israelis have, even if Hezbollah gets involved, that I think would mitigate the need for like very, very direct U.S. involvement. And I think the point that he makes is a good one, that, look, the big thing with Hezbollah that we all talk about is the rocket arsenal, but there's not much more to it than that, right? They are not like Danny mentioned, the Turkish military, the U.S. military, whatever. They do not really have the ability to rapidly deploy and project forces in a large region, right? They don't have, any kind of significant, capacities in other domains, right? You got to have air capabilities, you got to have naval capabilities, all these other things. And Hezbollah is more limited in that sense, and they are more of a non-state actor as far as what those capabilities look like. So I'm hopeful that even if there was further Hezbollah involvement, if we see that after Nasrallah's speech tomorrow, or we see further attacks along the border, even though those have been pretty contained to that Sheba Farms area of southern Lebanon, I think that the U.S. can stay out of it. But it of course depends on what that looks like, and it also depends on how far the Israelis want to go to push the U.S. to involve. Another question that we see in here from Alpha Beta is Blinken arriving a sign that things are not going to plan. Blinken is heading back to the Middle East. I think the question is like, okay, is that do you think that's not a good sign, Danny?
Well, I mean, I would expect that the Secretary of State would be making lots of trips to the Middle East. So by itself, that doesn't mean that there's not a plan. That means they want to do some face-to-face coordination. So I actually encourage that. Really, to your point a second ago about what we can do with Qatar, well, that's going to take some face-to-face discussions, and that includes also with the Jordanians, with the Egyptians, and the Saudis. I mean, those are some of the main ones in there, and I would expect that he would go through the region, to have some really frank discussions with all those, because it's crucial that we keep, this war from expanding beyond Gaza. And if Hezbollah does get involved, that it doesn't go beyond that either. And that means not into Iran. I think that and I hope this is what Blinken's doing in the area. That it's like, hey, even if Hezbollah gets in, we need to keep this contained, not to Iran, because it's just no love for Iran, obviously. But once you start getting involved in striking Iran, then you get the possibility this really does explode into a war, because Iran is much weaker than the United States, and even though they are a state, they can't sustain long-term fight against the U.S. So they don't want to have a war with the United States. But if we attack them, then they'll be forced to respond. They aren't just going to shrug their shoulders and roll over. I mean, if they get hit hard, there will have to be a response. And as I think you and I have talked about I don't remember if it was this show or on my show, but we talked about the risk to America of getting sucked into war by our troops in Iraq and in Syria. And of course, that is our point of greatest vulnerability if Iran does get involved in any way, because they can reach out and hit us there pretty easily. And that, unlike with Hezbollah getting into the war, Americans getting killed there could be a red line that could dramatically escalate the possibility of us getting drawn into and attacking Iran. That's what I worry most about.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Danny. That as for all the talk about Hezbollah, which I think is important, my biggest concern, again, not just for the safety of our servicemen and women that are in Iraq and Syria, but also for the ways that acts as a more direct lever for a war between Iran and the U.S. than Hezbollah really does, right? And so I share that concern, and you and I and a lot of our other scholars at Defense Priorities and other organizations have been sending that message loud and clear over the last couple of weeks. And I think it's important, not just for American audiences, but for everybody to really be asking, difficult questions about these things. As somebody that participated in the counterterrorism mission in these places for many years, it's even hard for me to admit that we don't really need to be there anymore. I understand why people that have spent a lot of their careers, a lot of their lives working on these issues, it's hard to kind of acknowledge that and step back and realize that. But look, the two reasons that the Biden administration gives for us to remain in Syria specifically, and they just renewed an executive order on October 12th, actually, of this year, just after the conflict sort of got going again, to say this explicitly is to defeat ISIS and to prevent Turkey from pushing further into Syria. And so as a quick background for our listeners, Turkey invaded Syria for about 30 miles into the country in 2019. And I was actually in the region while this happened, and I saw this happening firsthand. There was a lot of fear about what this would mean for the Kurds. There was a lot of confusion about, what the U.S. should do to, should we stop them from doing this? Should we not? And so Turkey has continued to occupy a small sliver of northern Syria ever since. And so it's important for people to understand that the U.S., okay, if one of the U.S. concerns, we'll take them one at a time. So the administration is saying we can't leave Syria because we're worried about Turkey, okay? So Turkey, as everybody knows or should know, has been facing a massive currency crisis for the past several years. The lira has lost 80% of its value against the US dollar in just the last 5 years. And you have Erdogan, right, making very strong statements explicitly in support of Hamas and saying that he wants Turkey to be a protector now all of a sudden for the wider Muslim world, including relationships with Arab countries that have traditionally been very fraught for Turkey. And so Erdogan has kind of put himself in a weird position where if he were to push further into Syria, even after a U.S. withdrawal of forces there, it would completely undermine everything that he just said in his speech last weekend, talking about defending Palestine and it's all, we're all in this together, all this other stuff. His relationships with the Arab League, with Iran, with Russia would tank. And those are relationships sadly, that are more valuable to Turkey at this point than they were a couple years ago, especially as Erdogan, pushes back more and more on the West. So I think if that's a concern, that's not really a valid one and it's overblown. And then the other concern is about ISIS, which Danny, you and I have talked about many times. ISIS was a threat. It was a huge threat to regional stability, to America, to our allies in the past. Okay, it was. I'm not denying that. Again, it was important that we confronted ISIS when they were the threat that they were. They controlled hundreds of square miles in Iraq and Syria. They had their global caliphate, right? But because of the efforts of the U.S. and the coalition and our local partners ever since, the caliphate was destroyed in 2019. And ISIS does not hold territory anywhere in the world anymore. And they are not the threat that they were several years ago. And so what the U.S. learned in Afghanistan, even if they went about it in a terrible way, was that you can conduct successful counterterrorism operations using local partners and unmanned systems and what are called over-the-horizon capabilities, right? America has that kind of power that it doesn't need to maintain a physical presence in the areas that it wants to do counterterrorism. So even if you argue that there's a limited ISIS mission that remains in Syria and we got to continue to fight ISIS, fine, but we don't need to physically be there. And we've been able to successfully conduct strikes on ISIS Khorasan in Afghanistan and all these other places around the world, without a physical presence there. So those are the two arguments by the administration. I know it's kind of a long stem winder I'm going on here, but if those are the arguments by the administration, they're not good arguments, okay? They're not good arguments. And if you look at the polling in America, 60, 70% of the American people are, against any of that further presence in Northeast Syria. So I think that's important to clarify. I know that Danny has got to run here in a sec. I want to go ahead and make sure that he can have an opportunity to weigh in on any kind of final thoughts, maybe what we'll see tomorrow from Nasrallah, any kind of thoughts on the updates we've seen the last couple of days to wrap up, Danny.
Yeah, Will. I thought that's. I see Dylan made that question there about what can we expect tomorrow. What I think it's not going to be is a declaration of war. If Hezbollah ever had any intention or desire to actually open up a northern front against Israel, they're not going to announce it. They'll want to get as much tactical surprise as possible. They want as much strategic surprise as possible. So I think what this is going to be is probably a lot of vague warnings. It's probably going to be of solidarity with the Palestinian people and the great Satan. Is United States and Israel, whatever, things that they say all the time, death to Israel, death to America. I think it'll be a lot of those. I think you'll see some of the things maybe even that Erdogan voiced to the other day. This is all the West's fault and all this stuff. It'll be a laundry list of a lot of things. And I think it's designed to placate some of the pressure on Nasrallah from the Palestinian people and from many of his fighters and backers who do want him to attack. But I think that he realizes he can't do that right now. So he'll make a lot of incendiary claims, but I don't think he'll do anything. That's not to say that he won't do anything eventually. In fact, I think if they do want to, I would imagine that they would be pretty tactical about it, and they would not want to give any indication to Israel that they do. They'll probably maintain the same level of these sporadic cross-border drone strikes and artillery raids and whatever that they've been doing. These sometimes 15, 20 a day, but just in the border region, I bet those will probably continue on at a low level. But if Israel gets deep into the Gaza Strip, especially into the city of Gaza, and they start suffering lots of military casualties and they get bogged down and the forward progress gets slow, then the danger and the risk of an unexpected, sudden attack from Hezbollah will be much higher, because it'll be much more difficult for Israel then to actually conduct a two-front war when one of them's already bogged down. So that's what I expect that he'll say tomorrow. I guess we'll have to see, but that's my thoughts on it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good breakdown, Danny. I agree with you. I know a lot of people are expecting that Nasrallah, declares war tomorrow. Given his handwritten letters and his comments about martyrdom on the road to Jerusalem and the final battle and all that. But I agree with you. I think that Hezbollah wants to be careful about preserving its forces. And if they do want to get involved at some point, they really have to make sure that they've thought through, right, every sort of second, third, fourth order effect of what that would look like. And I was on a space earlier with Malcolm Nance, with some other former intel and security people, and we kind of agreed that the best time for Hezbollah to get involved would have actually been in that immediate 72-hour period when the Israelis were totally confused about what was happening, and throwing them into a two-front war at that point would have been probably too much for the Israelis to handle, at least in the immediate term. But again, you saw reporting over the past couple of weeks that Hezbollah didn't, they weren't aware of Hamas's plans and these kind of things. So, that would impact their ability to plan for it. But no, I think this has been a really good conversation. We've been up here for just about an hour now. I know that Danny has got to run. Danny, any kind of last plugs? I mean, I mentioned, please go check him out on YouTube, Daniel Davis Deep Dive. Go ahead and look at his X feed, my X feed as well. Give us a follow. Give our think tank, Defense Priorities, at Def Priorities, a follow. We are dedicated to trying to give you guys objective analysis based in our experience, and we are not cheerleading for any side. We're not cheerleading against any side. We are trying
cheerleading for our side. I'll say for America.
Right.
I'm a cheerleader for America. I will point that out.
That's right. That's well said, Danny. We are trying to make sure that American foreign policy is responsible and is restrained, and that doesn't always mean that America has to go around the world putting out every single fire and getting involved in every single war.
Exactly.
And one thing that I want to harp on with that is look, a lot of people, when they see a crisis like this, love to talk about the dangers of inaction. They love to talk about, well, if the U.S., we have to do something. We're America. We're the most powerful country in the world. We have to do something. We actually don't. And we can actually think for a second and be much more careful about how we choose to respond to events like these, as opposed to, doing what we did after 9/11 and spending 20 years, occupying, 3 different countries in the Middle East and not really making America any safer or more stable in the process. And so I think it's okay to talk about these things and question them when you're doing so from the perspective of, look, we don't just want America's foreign policy to help America. We also want it to be more helpful to the world. And I think America's involvement in the Middle East over the past several decades, there are fair questions to be asked about how effective that has been and how useful it's been, not only for America, but for our partners and allies as well. And there will always be, different regional partners and allies looking to kind of, have the U.S. help them, because of course they would, right? That's how it works in international relations when you have, a hegemon, or you have a superpower, and then you have smaller states and regional powers that need to try to leverage those relationships. So that makes perfect sense. And again, I think there are ways that the U.S. can modify its force posture in the Middle East without abandoning or shortchanging any of our partners and allies. We have the money, we have the time, we have the relationships to find solutions that are more creative than just doubling down on what we've done in the past just because it's familiar, or because thinking about other ideas is too scary or whatever. So I think that's really an important point for people, that we want U.S. involvement in the Middle East, in Asia, in Europe, wherever it is, to actually enhance the long-term security and stability of those places, and not throw them into disarray. And I'm worried that, given America's role in the Middle East over the past 20 years, there are fair concerns to be had about that. So I think that's a good kind of note there. I'm going to go ahead and check the additional comments here. Anything else that